Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thank you for watching Enquiry. Over the last month, we've been focused on the terrible catastrophe of COVID-19 and the economic and humanitarian collapse around us. But today, the focus of our conversation is going to be different. Across the world, global financial institutions have responded to this crisis in unprecedented ways. The US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, they've thrown a kind of safety net across the global ecosystem. But in the past, after 2008, the response to the crisis led to its own crises. There was a rise in extreme political polarization. There was a rise of the kind of insurgent left and insurgent right. And the big question became who was protected and who was allowed to get hurt. At this very moment, those decisions across the world are being taken for us. So the question we really want to look at is how is COVID-19 affecting the psyche of global leadership? We've all been talking about a kind of post-COVID world and how we're going to emerge into a new global order. But will any of these things really happen? To examine those issues, I'm delighted to introduce our guest at Enquiry today, Adam Tooze. Adam teaches at Columbia University and is a historian of the 20th century. So you could say he's a kind of historian of collapse. He's also the author of a big book called Crashed, which examines the 2008 financial crisis and its impact on global politics across an entire decade. Thank you so much for joining us, Adam.
A pleasure to be here.
So Adam, as I said, you're a kind of historian of collapse. You've studied the rise and fall of societies, especially in the 20th century. There were the two world wars. There was the Great Depression. There was the Spanish flu. There was the Cold War. So you really have seen the dynamics of society in response to a crisis. Is there anything about COVID-19 that appears unique to you? Is there anything that surprises you?
I do think we are seeing the fragilities that we expected to see in Europe and the United States. We just weren't anticipating this shock. I think that's many of us had been thinking about the transition in the global balance of power between the West and China, or the impact of the climate crisis. I'm still struggling to figure out why it is that folks like myself never took seriously the pandemic issue. What it has exposed is exactly, however, what we would expected to see, namely the fundamental divisions within the European project, which are unresolved. Berlin is simply not providing the vision of how we move out of the impasse. In the United States, I think everyone in their right mind has been saying for a long time, America is its own worst enemy. America's internal problems are fundamentally why there is even any question about its standing in the world. If you were looking at it from a purely domestic point of view, you would always have said that the health system was the single most glaring gap. It's unfathomable. It spends more than any other society on earth. It spends almost 20% of GDP on the health system and doesn't provide coverage for a substantial minority of the population. And there was, huge amounts of work on the impact of globalization on the American labor market, problems of American populism and its relationship to the central bank. But I don't think anyone had sort of connected the dots that said, well, and the thing that will really come home to hurt you is the fragility of the healthcare system. So that COVID-19's been really head turning in needing to rethink. The basic wiring pattern is there, but we just hadn't connected up the right dots. We had a whole game plan for how the Anthropocene, how the environmental challenges of the present could feed back into the economy. We thought it was operating on Greta Thunberg's kind of timeline of 12 years, maybe decades, and it turned out to operate in a matter of weeks. And that I think is the real shock.
So Adam, you've made some really important points, which is that while the world was focused on everything else, what's ended up bombing the world is the 2 or 3 things that no one was focused on: the absence of healthcare, zoonotic diseases, and climate change. But I don't think that's really top of mind still. I'm not sure people make that connection between the pandemic and climate change. We've all kind of known about the butterfly effect and how action in one side of the world has a kind of reverb effect across the world. But you've been writing about the bat effect, which is that the entire world has now become so interconnected that the question is, how will we manage this interconnected world when nature is hitting back? So can you make all these connections clear?
There is a direct line in that we think that climate change and temperature change affects the spread of global diseases. Ever since the late 60s, early 70s, the so-called ecological approach to the study of infectious disease has been stressing the impact of humanity on the natural environment. Whether it's through stressing wildlife or whether it's through the immense accumulations of industrially farmed chickens and pigs that we see in Europe, Latin America, and also in China. The risk of zoonotic mutations, so animal diseases shifting into the human population, is hugely increased. And once they do that, then the risk of them spreading very rapidly is enormously increased, and globalization compounds that. And scientists began to worry about this really in the late 60s. By the late 80s, early 90s, more or less at the same time that global scientists are also becoming concerned about climate change, which is being driven by a similar set of causes. In other words, industrialization, modernization, urbanization. The whole series of international conferences begin on the paradigm is called emerging infectious diseases. So it isn't old familiar diseases like TB and malaria, it's new ones. The paradigm case is HIV/AIDS. But the worry is that there will be a leap, and it'll be something like avian flu, which would go from being highly infectious and lethal to chickens to jumping into the human population. And that's really the one that scares everyone. So now back to climate. Over the last couple of years, people interested in financial regulation have begun to worry about how a climate shock might destabilize the financial system. And the model that we have is indirect. So some very bad climate event happens, driven by all of the things we're familiar with. And then politics responds and says, right, okay, so now we have to change the way in which we do everything. I think the model here is a little bit the decision by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2011, who after the famous Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan said, right, we're ending nuclear power production in Germany virtually overnight. And this devalued the assets of the German electricity utilities who'd invested billions in nuclear power. And they suddenly found themselves in very serious financial trouble. So people in the central banking community started thinking very dark thoughts. Imagine there is a bad scenario climate-wise, then there's some catastrophe, then jumpy politicians realize they have to react quickly. And all of a sudden, the entire regulatory paradigm for our energy sector changes. What happens to asset prices? They suddenly reset. So then you get, a financial crisis. That was the model that we had, and people were working on it very actively over the last couple of years and preparing for that scenario. But we thought that would unfold over a decade or so, right? So we had time to prepare. Along comes a classic case of an emerging infectious disease. It's coming out of this cauldron of central China where you have incredibly dense interactions between big cities and wildlife markets. And then Beijing can't control it. And within weeks, we're resetting all the prices for everything in the entire global economy because we don't know. But it isn't direct. It isn't, it's not the disease by itself, the fact that a lot of elderly people would die prematurely. That's not what's causing the financial crisis. It's the response of the government to that risk that resets all the prices and causes the financial markets to react. So there it's like it's a third order or fourth order response. So we had a model of how a natural event induced by our collective drain on nature's resources could lead to a financial crisis, but we didn't understand the time frame it could operate on.
Right.
Cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
So, Adam, what could be the real shifts in thinking that will arise out of this? When you're saying something so kind of, watershed is a very mild word, something like such a big rupture happens, what will be the reorientation or what should be the reorientation in our thinking? Should the focus of economy shift? Should what we spend on shift? Is there an alternative to consumption? I mean, there were already so many malaces, there was a separation between just finance and actual wealth creation or trade.
Mm-hmm.
There was consolidation of wealth in the 1%. There was so much already going wrong. So after a rupture this big, what are the new ways the human race should organize itself?
Well, I think I would want to distinguish, and I'm going to sound conservative and too moderate here, but I think it's nevertheless worth. So, depending on what the problem is, and I think there's different approaches to the COVID-19 crisis. One could cruelly characterize as a sort of ambulance chasing approach. Something absolutely dramatic has happened. There's no doubt at all. It's hugely dramatic. This is an opportunity, therefore, to realize whatever project I already had. And in some cases, of course, that's extremely valid because we don't have any time to waste. And the issue that whatever your hobby horse is indeed very important. And so any opportunity is fair game to exploit it. And I think that's fine. It just doesn't tell us very much about the crisis itself. If you think about what COVID-19 particularly tells us, if you think of it as being driven by humanity's impact on the environment, what is the specific set of lessons we learn from it as opposed to all the other ways in which we impact on the environment, which is, say, driving climate change? When I think we think about climate change, what we're talking about are big structural transitions that we need to make. Thinking about, the urgency of the energy transition, or the urgency of just electrifying things and reducing our, dependence on oil and on gas. Those are structural commitments, and they pose huge problems, conflicts of interest in society. It's not obvious to me that COVID-19 is that kind of problem at all. But what I think COVID-19 specifically tells us is something about, and the British government has used this phrase just yesterday and has been mocked for the insertion of this. It's about alertness. And I don't think it's entirely wrong. It's evident that, like, from a point of view of an individual person, it's not going to help us very much, somehow virally alert, wandering around the street. But in terms of the lesson that this crisis teaches, there is something about our reaction time that's absolutely crucial, right? So we have to, going forward, when we think about how we face this particular type of risk, where we want to end up is where the South Koreans has ended up and not where America has ended up. And the difference between the South Koreans and the United States, I think, is quite aptly described in terms of alertness. When the South Koreans saw this problem coming, they took it seriously at the highest possible level immediately, or more or less immediately, and acted at a commensurate scale. So there's something about that, right, that the environmental challenges of the future are structural, yes, absolutely. But what COVID-19 tells us is that they're not just structural, they're more in the nature of a kind of a whiplash, right? We could do everything right on the structural side and still be blindsided by this kind of shock. So it's made the nature of the challenge much, much more difficult, because it's not enough simply to get the right structures in place. Britain and America both, I'm citing them because they have such terrible records with regard to COVID-19, both of them have highly sophisticated pandemic preparations. That they would have been ranked in the very top in the world in terms of their science base and their ability to go. And nevertheless, when it got serious, they failed in their response. And so that I think is the specific lesson. We need to be thinking about this all the time. We need to have a kind of an alertness and awareness of this risk.
But in fact, Adam, I was just going to say that listening to you is actually kind of, a bit head twisting, because one thought that there should be radical shifts in our preoccupations, priorities, just economic behavior. But what you were just saying is that actually what this should arouse in us is better disaster management, because disaster can come in any shape. And so, we need disaster management. And that's really been the response, actually, that it's not that one is really thinking deeply about the way human life is now arranged in the modern world, but just that, we need better technology, we need surveillance, we need, it's been that. It's like a very technological...
But don't get me wrong. I'm all in favor of rethinking the structural stuff. We should be doing that for other reasons. That's what the climate crisis demands. That's what, for more fundamental spiritual dislocations, demand. They demand that. But let's not kid ourselves that if we did that, it would save us from this problem. right? So the fallacy in that way of interpreting this moment is that it will not help you. There's just too many of us on the planet living too intensively. I mean, short of, conceivably, I guess, a vegan lifestyle for the entire population of the planet, this zoonotic risk will remain pressing. It is that attentiveness that we also need on top, right? We need an awareness, we need a level of consciousness about this risk and how quickly it can come get us. And I actually think of that structural interpretation as a little bit escapist. It sounds very dramatic, it sounds very profound, and it is profound and dramatic. It's just, it's a bit like saying, I'm going to be safe driving my very fast car because I go to the gym a lot. Well, sure, yeah, going to the gym is great. And all of the Formula One racing drivers do go to the gym because unless you have great neck muscles, you can't go around the corners that fast. But that isn't what makes them great Formula One drivers, right? It's their lightning quick reactions that do. That, I think, is the specific challenge of this crisis.
But then in that case, Adam, there is no real impulse to change anything, and so all this kind of end of time thinking that people have been doing is not really going to happen. It required a monetary response. The banks and governments have done that. It needs a technological response. Google and Apple and surveillance is going to do that. And by and large, then it's going to be business as usual, as soon as things lift. So it's not really then as gigantic an event as perhaps we've all made it out to be.
Oh, well, I mean, but hang on. It could happen again. This is just, if you're feeling optimistic about the recovery, the recovery from where we're at right now might not be V-shaped at all. We could be 2 to 3 years from now still living in post-COVID-19 territory. That would make this, an absolutely profound shock. The unemployment numbers, both in India and in the United States, are like nothing I ever imagined I would ever see. A third of the people working in the state of Kentucky have signed on for unemployment insurance in 2 months. Now that's an absolutely massive shock, and we will have to reckon henceforth seriously with the possibility of this happening again. So that will cause fundamental shift. I would expect there to be extraordinary, vested interest in ensuring that this doesn't happen again, because a lot of people who are very powerful are losing an enormous amount of money very immediately, right? This isn't like the climate crisis that threatens your grandchildren's ability to play golf if you're a billionaire. That's really what's at stake. That isn't COVID-19. COVID-19 is interrupting absolutely everything. So no, I would expect there will be really quite concerted push to stabilize some of these crisis management structures, risk reduction structures that we need. Is that a structural fix? No. Absolutely granted. Will this fix the climate problem? No, we've seen CO2 emissions globally maybe down 6 or 7% this year with this crash in economic production. We need to do that every single year for 10 years. Are the chances of that increased by this event? No, I don't think they are. But I don't think we'll come out of this and everything will be the same again. I think that wouldn't be the conclusion I would draw.
But Adam, I also think that something that perhaps one is not talking about enough is that the reaction to this and the kind of global lockdown that happened is also because of technology and media. I don't think there's ever been this kind of global focus on one thing. And some of the mathematical models may actually be wrong, like in the Indian experience has been different. And this is almost like a self-wrought crisis now, because for whatever reasons, we were too alert, I would say, because, even before the crisis hit, we've kind of engendered another crisis. There's specific reasons why New York and Italy have been the kind of epicenters they've been.
We don't know yet, but your more general point, I think, is absolutely valid. Various sociologists of risk have been saying this since the 1980s, right? That we live in a world which generates risks, but we also live in a world that is capable of generating a hyperbolic description of risk. And those calculations are always counterfactual. They're always about a future that we don't actually realize. And we have to live with that too. And so we are indeed going to live in a state of absolutely perpetual tension, and no doubt questions will be forever asked about the wisdom of the decisions made in Delhi with regard to the Indian lockdown. Was it the right thing to do? Was it, could it have been done better? But that is the nature of this is going to be the nature of political decision making going forward ever more dramatically, again and again and again. And if you look back in the history of the management of major epidemics, this is 1976 was the first moment when we had vaccine technology that we could roll out quickly enough to actually give a government the chance in the United States to vaccinate its population in real time. And the first flu epidemic that came to the United States, they had an outbreak of swine flu in the spring of 76 on an army base, and the Ford administration, the one that succeeded Nixon, for the first time faced the question we face now: what do we do? And they decided to immunize at great cost as much of the American population as they could reach. And then it never turned into a big epidemic. And it discredited the entire epidemic preparation program in the United States for years to come. Same thing happened in 2009, when there was the great swine flu scare and the WHO declared a global pandemic. Lots of rich countries triggered their emergency buying programs. They had pre-existing contracts with the major drug companies to buy all of their capacity for vaccine, ended up dumping it on the developing countries at the end of the year because they weren't using it. So when Ebola hit in 2014, the WHO was incredibly late to declare it an emergency because they didn't want to have the experience of 2009 again. Right? So we are all collectively going to oscillate back and forth. And indeed, that will imply, as you're saying, that we will be in self-generated states of crisis all the time. I mean, President Macron of France was not wrong when in the interview with the FT, he described this as an anthropological shock. I mean, everyone has bought into this, regardless of the radical difference of our circumstances. And as you're saying, it turns out the radical difference of the course of the disease. It was like, we've all agreed that this is our common crisis.
But you mentioned that, I forget which scientist it is, but has spoken about the prevention paradox as well, that if all your systems kick in and you prevent the disaster from happening, then everyone says, oh my God, you had it wrong, it cost too much, and also that if you prevent disease, then it seems like all the expenditure on public health is a waste because there's no crisis, so.
The Germans have been really kicked in the butt by this. Yeah, so, but I mean, as a historian, I think just welcome to history. This isn't a lab, nor would we want it to be a lab.
Just an observation before we move to something else is that the fires in Australia and California and Amazon did seem to kind of bring all of this much closer, so it's not in the future. There was already something so like cataclysmic happening before COVID did, and so I think it's definitely coming closer and closer, and we need to think more deeply about, just very deep structural changes. It's being forced on us, whether we like it or not.
But it's important to just re-emphasize, if you think about typhoons in the Bay of Bengal, we know what a huge difference effective disaster management makes to the loss of life that results from that. There used to be typhoons that would kill hundreds of thousands of people. With highly effective management now, you can enormously shrink that number down, right? That doesn't make the typhoon go away. It doesn't stop the genesis of the typhoon in the warming waters, but it manages the number of people that will become victims of that shock. And it's to do with early warning, it's to do with effective, emergency stuff, all of the stuff that Bangladesh has put in place now, which now makes a huge difference to the survival chances of Bangladeshis. That's the kind of mechanisms that we're going to, that for me is a really good illustration of this logic I'm talking about, right? Because the global effect, the warming is generating the typhoons and the instability of the monsoon and whatever, but how much damage that does depends on your coping capacities.
No, in fact, there's a kind of triad of gods now. There's the dollar, there's nature, and there's technology. And it's really these three gods that are playing with our lives in different ways. By and large, there's this sense that technology can sort anything, and that one doesn't need drastic changes in human behavior.
Well, I mean, in that triad, I think it's an interesting way of formulating the money bit is the easy bit. It was what I would say. It's like
I want to come back to that whole equation, but
Mhm.
before that, how do you read the economic scenario for India, Adam? What do the government has responded with, I think, like a 0.5 or 1% of the GDP, whereas other countries already committing hugely. Do you understand from a distance what is being done here? What are the problems you foresee which will hit us? And what are possible positives that could arise out of this?
I have to say, I should restrain myself from making any in-depth comments about the Indian economy. It's absolutely not my domain. I have no particular expertise on the Indian side. And in a sense, that's telling, right? Because it would be difficult for me to have a diagnosis of the global economy without spending quite a lot of time thinking about China and being able to answer an equivalent question about China. And that's still not true for India. Right? As large as India is as a piece of human experience, broadly speaking, this has to do with the limited degree of financial integration. So obviously the Indian financial system has been under considerable pressure in recent years because of exchange controls and various types of limitation on the movement of capital in and out of India. It remains relatively insulated. That enables it to function with a degree of autonomy. That doesn't mean that there aren't huge stresses within the Indian economy itself. Analysts were saying going into this crisis that India for the first time was experiencing an advanced economy style financial crisis. It was having a meltdown in its shadow banking sector. So how that plays out in light of a COVID shock, I think, is anyone's guess right now. People were beginning to worry about the scale of the Indian government deficit. But I do think it's obviously like a huge issue as to how Delhi will respond given the scale of the shock delivered by the lockdown. I mean, it is spectacular, and how you devise a response that will actually address the needs of those that were hit hardest, which is clearly the informal sector, the migrant population, the migrant workers. It's clearly a dramatic situation, and indeed the Indian stimulus response so far looks moderate. But so far that's been true in China as well. So it may be that this isn't the moment that we see that kind of dramatic government stimulus. If so, one might fear a social crisis.
So that's what I wanted to pursue, Adam, that when you see ruptures of this scale, will nothing new emerge from that? There's been so much talk, for instance, about universal basic income. Do you see that coming through in at least some countries? There's been talk about deglobalization, about focusing on domestic markets. I was speaking to Tom Friedman on Enquiry, and he was saying that America will start looking at 3D printing and delinking from many supply chains. So do you see any of that happening? Just what is the big picture stuff?
I mean, I think neither in the Europe nor in the United States is there any prospect of universal basic income being realised. It's just simply too expensive. So, as a temporary measure, it's possible to imagine it being done. I understand the visionary case being made for it. It's not happening either in the United States or Europe. It's too expensive. On the deglobalization side, I think it's going to be quite complicated. I understand, this argument that what we're going to see is a sort of regionalization of various types of supply chain. For essentials, that I can see the logic of that. For basic medical supplies, no one's going to want to repeat this experience. But I mean, think about the global car industry, which is the industry which actually dominates the global supply chain story. If you look at the mappings of where these complex supply chains are, it's essentially the major auto industries which drive this. The only other industry which comes close is the smartphone industry. They're not going to deglobalize, I don't think. What they will do is regionalize, and they're already doing that. 3D printing, I mean, Americans get very high on various types of new technology. I don't expect that by itself. It's still just too expensive, and it's not going to turn out the scale and the volume that people want.
I'm starting to smile, Adam, because forgive me if it's like I'm pushing you for drama that may not exist, but it's just like, because you've literally been a historian of, like I said, this rise and collapse of societies, that is then really nothing dramatic that's going to come out of something so large.
I think we may be talking past each other. I mean, I think that, the trends in global politics were quite dramatic, and, they were already dramatic. It's not as though by saying, if we go back to normal, that would simply mean that we were going back to something very extreme, right? We're going back to a world in which the movement towards multipolarity is absolutely radical, where we have a clock ticking on climate. We have a world in which the future of politics that we take for granted, whether it's in the democracy of India or the United States or the future, are all up for grabs. What COVID does is to impact all of those already open questions with the most intense shock, probably, that the economy has suffered, certainly since 1945. The prognosis for 2021 is not of some sort of calm, where would we return to? We would return to last year, where we thought the world economy was being ground to a halt by a radical surge of geopolitical uncertainty. And that's pretty much where we're headed.
Right.
If we can, in fact, stitch the supply chains back together again.
Yeah. So, post Second World War, Adam, there was the Marshall Plan and, all the spending. Do you think that some have been arguing, and it was interesting, the Financial Times to New York Times to The Economist, whichever end of the spectrum you come to at this moment, maybe because the fire is on the house, that people are saying that whole balance between markets and public good needs to be rebalanced. And it's interesting, all ideologies have collapsed. Everyone is saying that right now. Do you see that as one big change that might come out of this?
I think I'm going to sound so endlessly deflationary. I know and have a great deal of respect for many of the journalists involved in those newspapers, but what on earth are they thinking about? Seriously, the welfare compromise of the mid-20th century is born out of titanic total war, which involved the mobilization of the entire populations of societies which had powerful organized labor movements and powerful, what by modern standards would be incredibly radical, social democratic parties, in the context of a global struggle with the Soviet Union. That's what the welfare state came out of. That's what the Marshall Plan came out of. That's how the rebalancing of priorities and this stuff that they invoke so easily, that's what that came out of. And absent those forces, it doesn't happen. It just simply remains talk. Right? It really does, because what we're talking about is, deciding whether or not somebody is going to pay an 85% marginal tax rate. I mean, and that doesn't happen without a rebalancing of power, of political power. And what happened in the middle of this epidemic is that Bernie Sanders folded his campaign, and I don't remember anyone noticing. So what, in the most important Western state, the possibility for a radical transformation from the left disappeared at that moment. Joe Biden will recruit his team of advisors from exactly the same centrist fold that Obama's came from. And periodically, somebody like Larry Summers will remember that, the distribution of income really, really matters. And then he'll sort of look at his models and he'll say, oh, you know what, redistribution happened when there were trade unions. It'd be really good if we could have some trade unions. I mean, he's literally done this in print, and he's an extraordinarily smart man. But it's just,
you said,
Larry, do you understand what that means? You don't just get trade unions, right? It requires decades of life and death commitment by generations of activists and people willing to take the kind of risks that are involved in organizing labor in a country like the United States. And without that, no dice. And without an enemy, there's no Marshall Plan without anti-communism. But the Marshall Plan doesn't directly lead to McCarthyism, but McCarthyism and the Marshall Plan are born out of the same soup. So no, there's no prospect of a Marshall Plan to any substantial degree like that. We could maybe do some G20 2009 thing. Does that mean that we smooth sail forward? No, this is a prediction of crisis, right? If we go on like this, more shocks, more crises, more unanticipated consequences. So this isn't plain sailing. This is basically the diagnosis of an unsustainable situation, which is going to continue. You're helping me, sort of distill what my gestalt of this situation is, and it's certainly not smooth sailing.
But in fact, Adam, it's amazing you brought that up, because for me, the shock of even India's response to what has been such a visible and stark humanitarian crisis, and again, I'm not speaking from some bleeding heart position, it just seems unpragmatic to have 90% of your country disenfranchised, which is really our informal sector. But the response to that in two of our biggest states, Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, has been to suspend all labor laws for 3 years, which includes all safety nets. And the rationale is that this will woo industry, it'll woo investors. And you think after a crisis like this, that even that idea of common good has not come in, that you won't even rethink enterprise. Like labor makes up 6 to 12% of your balance sheets, and you can't reorganize industry in a way that can create basic distribution of wealth. This is the response to the pandemic in India.
Compare with China. I mean, what we're saying in India is presumably the elites which made those decisions feel very confident about their ability. Either they're just befuddlingly unpragmatic, as you're saying, or just they can't join up the dots, or they're just supremely self-confident about their ability to ride out whatever trouble comes their way. What is striking about Beijing is that Beijing's response was to talk about how they can extend their social insurance and health insurance system to the more vulnerable migrant labour population. I mean, that's the move they've made, which, and one could quibble, and I'm sure they know there's a lot of window dressing, and Beijing is incredibly good at presenting itself, but you've got to give them credit for it. It's like they appear to understand that legitimacy is going to be secured by way of ensuring that, you broadly speaking, in an emergency like this, try and bring people in. To be fair to the American system, they have tried to do this, but it's really like sticking a sticking plaster on somebody who's bleeding out from a massive hemorrhage. On the bailout, it's been interesting this time around how it's morphed. America's a profoundly unequal society, and so the bailout is also profoundly unequal, but they have in fact been quite sensitive of steering away from certain entanglements that might remind you too much of 2008. So, for instance, they're not using any of the big banks. The Fed isn't using the big banks to manage the bailout. What it means is it's using, you guessed it, BlackRock and PIMCO instead, right? So it's not using the usual Wall Street suspects. It's just using the two largest asset managers in the world. So there is around the edge a sensitivity to these issues, but it's not it's obviously not it's not a consistent reformist transformative politics. So there's a degree of nervousness about repeating 0809.
Adam, you've put out some really stark figures that the Federal Reserve spent more in about 48 hours than it had done in months after the 2008 crisis, or that it was buying bonds at $83 billion a day, $1 million in a second. I mean, those are just mind-boggling figures, So just absolutely last question to end with, Adam, that you made this statement that how the decision one makes about how to deal with the debt that's been created now with all the money that has been made available, or the credit that's made available, will define the politics that will ensue from this crisis. Could you paint both scenarios, that if one takes route 1, this will happen; if you take route 2, that will happen?
Yeah, I mean, if you go down the austerity route, if you treat the debt as an absolute obligation on the taxpayers of the countries which have run it up, then it basically becomes the rate limiting factor on everything they can do, whether it's education, whether it's commitments to the green energy transition. Then the interests of the creditors come first, and you have to ask who they are. And broadly speaking, it's the most affluent segments of society, and in some countries it's foreigners. The scale on which we're doing it now is absolutely massive. if you ask me, am I as optimistic and sanguine about the situation 2 or 3 years from now? That's not at all so obvious. There's a sort of Jekyll and Hyde nature to this. There's a Janus-faced quality to it. There is the liberal, expansive monetary policy moment at the moment of crisis itself. Last time round, all of the really difficult politics started 18 months later. So I think we really need to ask ourselves, what are the politics of this going to look like in 2022? Is a much more conservative impulse going to assert itself at that point? Are we going to return to the age of austerity with slashing of government budgets so as to pay back, the debts that were accumulated in this period? That will be the real test. Not as it were the crisis itself, but the aftermath. That's the moment when I think we really need to ask, how much have we learned? And so that is a choice. It's a choice that will, of course, uphold your credit rating, and you will in future be able to borrow at lower costs if you do this. But it massively constrains, and given the scale of the debt for countries like Italy, we'll be talking of 150+% of GDP, so an overwhelming debt burden for a country to bear. It will be crippling. The alternative is to find various ways of parking this debt, rolling it over, maintaining interest rates so close to zero that servicing the debt doesn't make much difference, neutralizing it in political terms by shifting it making it a claim, shifting it from being a claim of private creditors to being a claim of the central bank against the government, or being willing to bite the political bullet and finding the political muscle necessary to tax the more affluent members of society such that their resources are transferred into public hands and then back by way of the government budget to the people that are owed the money. And in many cases, that will be the same people. So the rich will discover they owed the money to themselves. The terrifying prospect, of course, is that ordinary citizens who pay value-added tax, sales tax, consumer tax, who are dependent on government spending, will find their incomes, their life chances crimped by the needs to service debts owed to the most privileged in society. It's a straight distributional issue. The damage was done during the crisis. All these are paper claims which we're carrying into the future, which we're going to decide, and we have to decide amongst ourselves what they're worth and who gets what. Because all we're doing is subsequently making ourselves feel better about the loss we suffered now by means of shuffling future income around between different groups. This is a manifestly political problem. It shouldn't be treated as anything else. It shouldn't be allowed to slip into the realm of the credit rating ages and everything else. It is absolutely core political issue and should be addressed at that level. Who gets what from whom? That's the fundamental issue here. This is so large that we can't just treat this as a day-to-day business. Of course, you pay your debts. All debts have to be settled. In the ordinary run of things, that makes perfect sense. This is an emergency, and the sums involved are massive, and so we have to politicize this.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Pleasure.
This is just a lot of insight, and one's disturbed by those insights, but we are where we are. So,
okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. You too, Adam. See you.
Cheers.